There we go. All right, we're starting. Recording is on. And we have a link to some general questions that we're going to ask our panelists to talk about in the chat. But to anybody new and old Duke students or non-Duke students, please just feel free to type a question in the chat or unmute and ask a question. We are all here and we all hope to answer your questions. So to start, I guess first we can say we're Duke Disability Alliance. We're the student organization on campus that is advocating for accessibility and justice for students with disabilities and without disabilities. And we have our panelists here today who are Naira Ikram, Sydney Aquilina, Bailey Bowell, and Jay Pand. So if you four would like to introduce yourselves, that would be a great way to kick it off. Maybe we could start off with Naira.
Hi everyone, I'm Naira. I'm a rising junior and I'm studying a program 2 on psychoneuroimmunology, which is basically looking at what makes people stressed in the first place and then why stress tends to make people sick. So I started the Autoimmune Campus Alliance like a year ago, and the purpose of that group was to serve as like a support system for students with autoimmune diseases, as well as like people who don't have that condition like myself, but like want to help out and like be connected to other people and just like create like a safe space for people with like the autoimmune diseases are now being seen as like invisible disabilities. And so I then decided that it would be great to like make this as like a subgroup within DDA because there's so many amazing individuals there and it's a lot more powerful to work with more people than just do your own thing on the side. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Naira. Next up, Sydney.
Hi, I'm Sydney. I am a rising, sorry, almost a junior, rising senior now at Duke. And I'm majoring in philosophy, minoring in global health and chemistry. I'm also pre-med, so kind of have a diverse array of classes that I've taken during my time at Duke. I've also kind of taken a special focus since taking Dr. Q's class my freshman year on trauma activism, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed culture, everything along those lines. So yeah, and I am looking forward to being able to spend this time with y'all.
Thanks so much, Sydney. Bailey, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm Bailey. I am a rising senior at Duke. I study English and philosophy. So cool to see another philosophy major. I started the American Sign Language Club at Duke. We primarily have group lessons for free because Duke does not currently have American Sign Language instruction, although advocacy for those courses and other deaf community related accessibility measures are definitely a part of the club's focus and goals. Full disclosure, I don't identify as a part of the deaf community, but I was hard of hearing for several years. I had to have an eardrum artificially reconstructed. So I have a little bit of perspective on it, but I'm not claiming to speak for deaf individuals. I just am an advocate for the deaf community.
Thanks so much, Bailey. And finally, Jay.
Yeah, hey everybody, my name is Jay. Let's see, I am a super senior here at Duke, graduating in fall 2020. I am studying computer science, and my interests, I suppose, disability justice is definitely chief among those. Other than that, I don't really get up to much, at least at Duke. Just like watching comedy in my spare time. So that's about it there. What was it? What else was I going to say? Since you can't see on the video, I have CP, so I use a walker. Most of the time in a wheelchair sometimes as well. So yeah, that's about it for me. And I guess I should say also, I was president of DDA, I guess about, is it really 3 years ago now? I think so. Wow, time flies. So let's see. Yeah, so I was president for a year there, and we when I was president, we started working on the cultural center. So I think we did our first survey for that, and then we also brought 3 artists to Duke to the Nasher for Disability Pride Week. So we definitely were able to do a lot of great events there. So I guess that's some of my history in regards to the club. But yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jay, and everybody for introducing yourselves. Guess we can head right into our first question, and during the questions, I guess anybody who on the panelists who would like to speak up about it, just feel free to unmute and answer. So our first question is, what are some of the challenges students with disabilities face at Duke? And some subcategories that you might consider could be environmentally, culturally, socially, or this is another question, so we'll get to that later. So yes, what are some challenges students with disabilities face at Duke, environmentally, socially, or culturally?
I can go. So I think that one thing is that Duke just simply isn't built for people with disabilities. And by that, I don't just mean physically, but also structurally. And so whenever you look at who's making the decisions on organizing events or choosing what courses to have, or I don't know, all facets of student life, I think you don't see a ton of accessibility advocacy in those roles, or at least not visibly. And sometimes things just don't seem to be considered. So for example, like with American Sign Language not being offered as a course, that is not just a matter of, oh, I want to learn sign language, but it's actually a matter of accessibility. And part of the reason there are not a lot of deaf students at Duke. Whenever you go to a basketball game and they have a giant Jumbotron, but they don't put captions whenever they make announcements on it. Just little things all throughout the campus that you'll start to notice. I don't think that those things are necessarily being considered in all of the places that they should be.
Yeah, to like add on to that, yeah, because that's a really a huge one. But yeah, for one, I wouldn't say like SDAO has like the most convenient location. So that can definitely be a challenge, another like challenge, like physically, environmentally speaking. And yeah, and also I'd say in a like more cultural sense, at Duke, there's definitely this kind of like I got this mentality, and there's like this culture of perfectionism and comparison, and like these certain like very neurotypical standards, which can weigh heavier on students with disabilities, of course, who face unique barriers to achieving these like neurotypical like expectations. And so I'd say, yeah, even like for me personally, so I have like ADHD and I didn't have accommodations coming into Duke. And so there's definitely, I felt like this almost like stigma against like getting the help that like I needed. And so that's definitely, I think, prevalent, especially since not everyone, you know, like has this understanding about, you know, being able to like about like leveling the playing field, like for people with disabilities and those sorts of things. Even professors, there's like sometimes like skepticism about like whether, or students even like about whether, you know, accommodation needs are actually legitimate. And so that's definitely a boundary. And then like socially, this bleeds in too, because you have people who again, like just like have this lack of awareness, and you might even hear people, you know, bring up different things about people with disabilities, even particular disabilities, and you might go, oh, I have that, and that is not right. But you might not want to then say anything because you feel like then you'd be targeted. I have a friend who, for instance, has bipolar disorder, and so she's had various instances with even friends, like hearing people say things that are just very like stigmatic and stereotypical, and just her like feeling just unsafe around them, and unable to like just be totally honest because of those stigmas. And yeah, and I'd say there's also kind of the challenge of not wanting to be a burden to other people, and like just, you know, talking to people about these things, or yeah, so there's a lot of different things going on there. But I think the biggest additional thing is that there's just this tendency to have like, you know, different stereotypes, and yet at the same time, you have this just kind of like overwhelming almost like expectation to always like have like be able to achieve like certain standards. And so yeah, I would definitely encourage anyone who like is experiencing like boundaries to like reach out, because most of the time there's a way to like be able to address these things, and there's always someone else that's in your shoes too. And so just seeking out those people is the best thing you can do.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I think those are definitely a lot of great points, and I think it resonates. They resonate a lot with me personally. I think just a couple things to add. So I think definitely like there is the culture of getting by, like you said, Sydney. And I think especially for people with invisible disabilities, I think in a lot of ways they may have it more difficult than those of us who have a very like visible disability, because it seems like everything is fine. In terms of like you're not needing any particular accommodations or not needing to be treated differently, I guess. But of course, that's not always the case. And I think like particularly with regard to the location of SDAO, there's actually an interesting backstory there, which is that there have been students in the past who have wanted SDAO moved to a more like central location that's not on central campus. But there are other students who are afraid that if SDO is moved to a more prominent location, they would be identified as students who are registered with the office, and then there would be stigma associated with that. So it really is this kind of tricky balancing act. And I think that kind of goes into my next point, which is that there isn't really a whole lot of community, I would say, amongst people with disabilities. At Duke, there aren't very many of us here to begin with, and I think those of us who are here are kind of more inclined to do things on our own and not reach out to others, not share our experiences with others. Yeah, and I think, I think because people are afraid of the stigma that might come with sharing their experiences. So I think that's definitely a problem. What else was I going to say? So I think that, yeah, that's something that we definitely need to work on. And also even from an educational perspective, like I think like with some professors, or even a lot of professors, like for example, there's not really any training that takes place in terms of like how to deal with particular accommodations. Like for example, like if you need screen sharing in class, like what technology should professors use to do that? Like professors don't know really how to deal with this. And so, and even, so I think people are kind of reluctant to speak out about things because they might be received with confusion, even if not malice. And I think that extends to like friend groups as well. Like people just don't really know about disability, and so like there's like I think there's a fear even for me that people may not relate if I do share. So I think that's also a challenge.
Yeah, I think all of you touched on like the culture of effortless perfection at Duke and how it's like already harmful for students that are, I guess, conventionally healthy, but then it's even harder if you have any sort of disability. And yeah, it was really important that you mentioned, Jay, that if you have an invisible disability, people in a way like tend to cut you less slack for like rescheduling meetings last minute or not being able to follow up on like plans with friends or even with like professors. So that definitely gets really tough. Another thing is that the STIN form, which is for when you submit whenever you're not feeling well, that was designed with like short-term illnesses in mind. So if you have like a more chronic condition, it's harder to justify like not being able to make it to class or taking an exam. And that's so counterproductive because it doesn't make sense why you would ever take an assessment when you're not feeling at your peak performance. So yeah, and Bailey had mentioned that like Duke really isn't designed for people with any sort of disability, and that's reflected in if you have like a visible one or an invisible one.
Yeah, and Marion Grigi, our DDA's faculty advisor, mentioned that DDA, a huge part of DDA's mission, which we want to just share with everybody now, is building this community that all the panelists have touched on, that has been so lacking but important at Duke. And recently, and I think it's been mentioned briefly, but DDA has established a cultural center, a disability cultural center, very excitingly after a few years of work that Jay started. And it's been, we're hoping it'll serve as a center for not only resources for students with disability, but also this sort of like community building and kind of building this sense of celebration around the disability identity that I think is so foundational for, it's behind the stigma that has founded many of these problems that our panelists have mentioned, unfortunately. And in building the sense of celebration, we're hoping that we can eliminate the stigma. So yeah, DDA is doing very good work, and we're trying our best to address all these problems. So it's not all, down in the rut. Maddie, do you want to maybe move on to another topic?
Yes, yeah, we can move on to our next question. Just thinking about all those challenges you were just talking about, what's some advice that you might have about dealing with these situations and challenges that you mentioned?
I can speak quickly. I think that you're right, Simon, that it's not all bad. I think that there is a lot of actual activism happening, and there are a lot of people who are more, aware of these things or passionate about them than I think there were in my own circles, at least even just a few years ago. And there's a lot of exciting stuff that's happening, and getting involved in that can be really rewarding. And so if you are a prospective student, definitely please try out these clubs, DDA and Duke ASL, whatever you want to do, because there's never enough student activism with this kind of stuff. And I know that even for Duke ASL, I'm a senior now, and we were making a lot of decent progress, and now it's getting kind of stalled with COVID and stuff, so we have to continue that. But yeah, it gives you, I guess, like, it makes you not feel so hopeless whenever you see so many people also fighting for the same things that you see as vitally important and you want to bring to campus, want to bring to the student body. That's a really nice way to, I don't know, get involved or have some hope with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I think like being involved in like, there's always something going on within DDA or within like disability activism. So that just like is a really good way to like spend your time and definitely feel a lot more hopeful. I would also say like, I think a lot of professors and faculty and staff around Duke are very invested in like everyone regardless of like their ability status, and like getting to know them and like sharing your own background and experiences. And I think a lot of times, I think as Sydney was mentioning, that like people don't want to feel like they're a burden in any way. So I think showing that kind of vulnerability, like I don't think people see that as like being vulnerable at all. I think now it's like being seen as like very brave. So sharing that with like your professors, any like, I guess, like staff on campus as well as your friends. I think people are a lot more understanding, and they want to like be involved in your life and helpful in any way.
Yeah, great. I think those are definitely great points. Yeah, definitely don't be afraid to lean on a support network, because I mean, like, I'll be blunt, like, students with disabilities have an extra burden at Duke. It is hard to be a student with a disability, and it's not a fun experience. Um, and so I think really it's definitely important to lean on your support network and not let yourself get kind of bogged down by everything. Definitely reach out for help when you need it. I know I've depended a lot on my own family as supports for dealing with a lot of my challenges. So I think you just have to find that support network wherever you can get it. And I think DDA has also been great for me, even just to kind of vent about like some of the things that I'm feeling. Like, it's definitely very helpful. I think in terms of maybe more practical advice, or like more specific advice, let me say. I think it's definitely important to be proactive. You don't want to wait if you feel like you need help. Even with like registering with SVAO, for example, if you feel like you might need something, just go ahead and do it. I myself registered in March of the year before I came to Duke. So I got started really early. But so I think it's important to just get started as early as possible, because it does take a long time to get accommodations approved, and just in general to help. I think whatever you're dealing with, it just takes a while usually to help make sure people understand what you're going through and can give you the support that you need. So that's definitely important to be proactive and reach out when you need help. There was one other point that I wanted to make. Man, I forgot. If I think of it, I'll come back to it.
I'd say that, yeah, just to reiterate some other points y'all were making, they're really good. That every professor that I've talked to, you know, they even if they don't have necessarily a good background in like what you might need and or whatever it might be, like I'd say at Duke, they're pretty much like very just over the top on like trying to make sure that you're getting whatever it is that you need. And so even if like they might not realize, for instance, that, you know, XYZ was an issue, if you talk to them, they will work with you to like find a way around that in most cases. And if they don't, then that's something that you should bring to SDAO and see if maybe you can get that helped in some sort of more official way. And I'd also say, like, in terms of like resources and those sorts of things, there are like so many great initiatives at Duke. Like there is and like places for you to go. Like there's the Women's Center, which helps people out. There's like, you can, there's different like counseling and psychological services, things you can get get connected to through Duke. There's also CAPS, which I haven't personally used, but I know a lot of people have. That is a very like key resource in their time at Duke, and those that can be like through one-on-one meetings with people or like group stuff, and you know, I'd also just say like even talking to your like dean, if you know, say something comes up and you're having a hard time, you know, definitely go to your dean and tell them what's going on, and they can make it so that professors don't really have to even ask questions. They can just, you don't have to go up to your professor and explain whatever it is that's going on in your life. They'll make it so that you can just have them know and understand, even if they can't really understand, or you know, you don't want them to, of course. And then there's also the ARC. The ARC has like some really good resources for like ADHD and for other disability related academic learning issues. And even just more generally, you can get tutoring assistance through the ARC, that's you know, fellow students just helping you out. So yeah, the ARC has a ton of different good resources. That definitely doesn't exhaust them, but just in general, like if there's a resource, you're like, oh, I wish Duke had it, but I don't know if they do, like definitely look into it, because chances are they have it. And if not, then that's something that I'm sure Duke would be open to creating, and maybe you could spearhead it. So yeah.
I'll also echo Sydney on a few points really fast. So first of all, asking even if you don't think that you'll get help with something, or sometimes I know that, so for example, my friend has housing accommodations and she didn't get those for a long time because she felt like it wasn't serious enough to warrant it. But whenever she finally, got in and got the help with that from SDAO, she was able to actually have those accommodations, and they were serious. She was taken seriously. So don't be afraid of that. And then also with just your friends and your peers, I think being honest about things, you'll find more support than you realize. So I know, like for me, whenever I had a tough time, like mentally in my first year, I didn't really talk about it. But whenever I did eventually start talking about it to people, I realized I actually was absolutely not alone. You'll get a lot of support that way. And so I think that probably holds true for most things. So yeah, definitely, actually don't feel like it's not serious enough, and don't feel like you have to hide anything. Just ask.
Oh, and to add on to that real quick, so you reminded me, like, yeah, like I think with the whole like friends thing, like I think and like being able to relate to other students, maybe this is just me, but I found like actually I've found a lot of people just in the classes that I've taken who also have accommodations, and just talking before, after, just knowing then that you're not the only one in that class, for instance, that is using accommodations. Sometimes that ends up like developing a relationship between you and that person, actually a lot of times in my experience. And that can be really great, because then you have someone to talk about like whatever it is to. And that's a really great way to try to start building some more community. So, and people are generally very friendly too when you actually are open and honest, just like what Bailey was saying, even if they don't have a disability. So yeah, in my experience, like it can be difficult sometimes getting that out, but once you do, people are just so open to like hearing other perspectives. Even I was taking this one class where a lot of people so I have a brother with autism, and a lot of people were very clearly like not familiar with autism, and they're saying a lot of like very stereotypical things, like about like, oh, people with autism can't feel emotion and stuff like that. And so just sometimes bringing that perspective to the table, like even if you're afraid of being kind of like outed or something, people receive it very well. People generally want to learn and try to understand.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I did remember what I was going to say earlier, though. If you're in a course and you're getting bad vibes from a professor or from the course in general, just get out. Just get out. Like I've been burned before. It was bad. So just don't hesitate. You can find another course. It's not the end of the world. Just leave. Just find something else.
And if I wanted to just sort of offer myself as a faculty ally, I'm Dr. Creechy. I'm the faculty advisor of DDA. And if you ever are in a situation where you legitimately can't switch classes, and you're feeling really uncomfortable with the situation, know that you can reach out to DDA. We will be there for you. I think something that both Sydney and Bailey said that I really want to hammer home for anyone who might be new on this call is that you're not alone. You both said that. I think that's a really powerful message. And we talked about disability community being a really powerful way to help erase stigma and to empower all of us. And this is that disability community right here. And it's a really beautiful thing when we can be there for each other. So if you find yourself in a situation, even if you haven't been really active with DDA, reach out and we'll be there for you, and we'll help in whatever way we can.
Thanks so much for saying that.
And I may just chime in on what Mary was saying.
Absolutely.
Is that there's also a broader community, when we're actually on campus and not in all of these remote locations, there are services outside in the Durham community as well that can be of assistance. So don't forget about those resources as well, because there's a lot of resources within the community and within the state of North Carolina that are helpful.
Great. Thank you for that. And I guess now we can move on to our next question, which is, what is it like to work with the Student Disability Access Office, which people have been referring to as SDAO?
Yeah, I can go ahead with that. I think, let's see. So like I said earlier, it does take a while to get accommodations. And I mean, Duke doesn't give anything to you that easily. They really need to understand very well why, like, what you need and why you need what you need. But once you've showed them that, and once they understand that, then they will fight for you for whatever you've approved, what you have approved. I mean, I've had situations with professors in the past who didn't want to implement certain accommodations, and they lost that fight. So I think that's good. That's good to know, definitely. To be fair, I've spoken with students who have had like issues getting their accommodations. So again, I think that's probably the more difficult part of it. You have to get testing. It like takes a while to get for them to review all the documentation. Even paying for testing may be difficult. And I'm honestly myself, I'm not super familiar with the resources that exist for that. I'm sure there are some, so I think that's definitely something to be aware of, that it is difficult to get those accommodations, but once you have them, the going is smoother, I would say. You do have to meet with professors to go over your accommodations at the beginning of the semester. Like, you basically get a letter and you have to meet with your professors. And I would say that is, in my experience at least, that's been a good thing. Because you can really, you talk with your professors about what you need, they can more easily provide that, and then issues don't come up down the road with that if everything's been discussed up front. I guess, and to amend my earlier point about getting out of a class if you're getting bad vibes, I mean, obviously, you can stay in a course, and I guess it wouldn't be the end of the world that way either. It's just a lot more difficult to deal with a professor or deal with a course that's not the best fit for you, than finding another course that works well. So yeah.
So a question was brought up in the Zoom chat, and it was in reference to something I think Dan said earlier. What are some of the groups in the Durham area or North Carolina that can provide that additional assistance that we were talking about? And I know, Andrew, you responded with some resources like the North Carolina Department of Vocational Rehabilitation and Disability Rights of North Carolina. So if anybody else would like to share some, you could type it out or speak.
I started to try to type some things, and that's just taking too long on this iPad to do that. But I'll try to compile a list of things that I'm aware of and get it to DDA, get it to Marion or to you or to somebody to distribute or make it available. I mean, there's some, and I don't remember the name of all of these things, but there's a state office that then has specific people within the county, and they've got somebody who works with people who are deaf, specifically, as well as people who are blind specifically. And the Parks Department in Durham actually has a lot of, does have some programs that are specific to people with disabilities. There's a club, I guess it is, a basketball group that uses wheelchairs, and then there's the statewide group, Arts Access. There's the Lions Club, which is more involved with people who are blind and low vision. You know, and I'm probably most familiar with the areas that work with people who are blind and low vision, but there's several groups that work in that area specifically. And then there's the Mayor's Committee on Disability that also can provide an ear and a voice. You know, because you all, if you're in normal times, and hopefully we'll get to something that's close to normal, whatever normal is. I don't like that word, but using it anyway. Non-COVID pandemic times, at least. You know, you want to be out you want to be able to go to downtown Durham and to be able to make sure that that's accessible. You know, making your voice heard at those places. They're open ears, a lot of them. So I'll try to get that list together.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo the two organizations that Andrew brought up, Vocational Rehabilitation and Disability Rights North Carolina. I've had personal experience with both of those organizations, and I think they've been very helpful to me in the past. So definitely great resources.
And just to bounce off something Jay said earlier about like it sometimes being expensive to get this testing done that you might need. I am aware, unless this has changed, which is possible, that in the Triangle area to get like more psychological like testing, diagnosis, all of that, they only usually accept Duke insurance. So if you're not getting Duke insurance, you might want to get that done at home before you come to Duke, because I actually was fortunate enough to be on the rowing team my freshman year, so they paid for it. But when I went there, that was something I am not on Duke insurance, and so if I hadn't had rowing, I would not have been able to get tested there unless I paid a lot of money. So yeah.
Hello, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Can y'all see me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. I did tag in late. I was listening to what everyone was saying. My name is Shakima McLean. I am not a student of Duke. However, I am connected within the disability community. And I've attended quite a few workshops that was held at Duke. So I'm kind of impressed about that. On the outskirts of which I was mentioning, that Duke doesn't have much accessibility for you all. I just wanted to just speak about what Dan had mentioned as far as the resources, and everything he's mentioned is correct, and hopefully that list will look very long. But I too can also help. I reside in Raleigh. I am the former chair of the employer resource from the Mayor's Committee. So I wanted to tag a little bit along about that. We are located here in Raleigh. Because of COVID virus, of course, you know, it kind of postponed a lot of meetings. But our meetings would be normally every third Thursday of each month, okay, between 12 and 1 o'clock. So if you're sort of somewhat interested, or if you're available, when we're able to all come face to face and see how everyone is doing, our doors are always welcome. We're downtown at the municipal building. If you would like any more information about that, I can provide that for you. But again, I just wanted to chime in on what Dan mentioned in regards to, it's called the Mayor's Committee of Persons with Disabilities. And what we do, you know, like he stated, you know, we sit around and we speak about different events and issues that occur throughout the state. We try to, you know, have enough information about what's going on within the states, within this state. We are broken into different sections. And again, my former seat is called the Employees Resource, which around the ADA, which we always recognize, which just passed, ADA, this year made the 30th anniversary of the ADA. And if you don't know what that is the American Disability Act. That was pretty much bodied law from back in 1990. Not so long ago, last year, former Mayor McFarland and Governor Cooper has adopted into a proclamation for July 26th. So if y'all see different organizations, states, and celebrate ADA, that's what that's about. But yeah, I just wanted to just give a little light history or light thoughts on if you're interested. And again, by all means, come meet us, join us. We're always open, to suggestions. We are a board that does accommodate individuals with disabilities of all kinds, visible and invisible. So here. So I just wanted to chime in on that one.
Thank you so much, Shakima, for what you were saying. That's awesome. We're glad you could make it and speak to our panel. That's really great. Thank you. I guess if nobody has anything else to add about, I guess, our previous question with SDAO accommodations or other community resources, we can continue to our next question, which is how have representations of disability affected perceptions at Duke?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just real quick, I would say there are very few representations of disability, and that affects perceptions because no one thinks about disability. And no one is knowledgeable about disability, like people have said. So I think that is a real problem and something that DDA has definitely worked to address. And I know Marion is doing a lot of great work as well on that. So it's hopefully that is changing. So we'll see.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was 2 years ago that Marion had organized at a disability conference at I think it was at the Ruby. And I remember that was very well received, and people in the Durham community were really excited as well as Duke students. And I don't know if there were maybe people out of town too. So that was really great to see. And I know people have been asking hopefully that another one of those takes place in the future after all this pandemic's resolved. And the other thing was that I don't know if they're still doing this this year for pre-orientation, or not pre-orientation, but orientation for freshmen, but there's a U at Duke session, and that's when they have different, I guess, posters with different types of identities, and then I don't know if this was if the disability one was created from the start of this session's creation, but I know that when I was facilitating that last year, most of the freshmen were pretty quiet because it's probably their 10th orientation program of the week, but they definitely, more conversation was generated around the disability part because it's one of those things that people genuinely want to learn more. And then we also talked about invisible disabilities that a lot of people didn't even know about that, and so they were even more curious. So I think perceptions of disability at Duke are limited, but those that do know about it want to get more involved, and yeah.
Yeah, and there's you can go.
No, go ahead, Sydney.
Oh, I was gonna say just to add, I know personally a lot of people that are very interested in actual if there was that opportunity to be able to get a minor or a major that, or just take classes that are related to disability, especially since Duke has a really large pre-med population, and so there are a lot of people that would be very interested because it's just very relevant to what they're going into, or for other reasons it's just being close to them in some other way, or just something that they don't know about, so they're therefore curious about it. So there is a lot of interest in that sense, but it's just not very much something actively thought about, or along those lines, I guess. So yeah, just like to reiterate that there is like this interest, but it's more of, it's kind of like it's, you know, underneath the water, so to speak, you know, people have it, but it has to be like brought up.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Sydney on that, especially with ASL particularly. There's a lot of, I think, intrigue with the language, and a lot of people are really interested in sign language, which is awesome. We regularly have so many people who really want to learn it, but then when it comes to actual like knowledge about deaf culture and accessibility and then other things like that, it's just that the education is lacking there, and part of that is because there aren't the courses to take, but also I don't know, like it's there, but like you said, it's kind of an undercurrent right now. Yeah.
I would love to talk about curriculum for a moment, since this is 100% in my wheelhouse. So Jules and I are actually part of an interdisciplinary faculty team that are working really hard to try and build a program in medical humanities and disability studies at Duke. And we have a large and very invested student task force affiliated through DDA that is helping us with that goal. So if anyone is new to DDA or new to Duke and you're interested in that, totally let us know. We'd love to have you in the group. We're going to be working on a real proposal to the university to actually make this real. We're also applying for external funding and stuff. So there's a lot of activity going on there. If you're an incoming freshman, you can start by taking my Writing 101 course, which is called Disability and Democracy. I think registration isn't even open until next week, which it's weird that we're doing this O-week panel and school hasn't even started yet. I don't even have students in my class yet. So it's a little strange this year, but I'm hoping that it'll be a really good class and you'll get to talk about disability and democracy, obviously, is the other word in the title, but just representations of disability as well. And we'll start by watching Crip Camp, and I'm really excited about that. Yeah, I feel like since the question was about representation, I do want to talk at some point, I don't know if there's time in this session, but how representation is changing in mainstream culture and how there are more representations on things like Netflix, just sort of starting to incorporate more. It's still, I've been frustrated historically with how white and male a lot of the representations have been. But I think even that is starting to change a little bit. And just another thing that makes disability studies so interesting is that it's a really great way to learn about intersectionality. And DDA is really invested in intersectionality and have been working a lot this summer on intersections with Black Lives Matter. And that's something that Maddie has been working on with Dakota Douglas. And I'm super proud of that work. So just a topic that we hadn't mentioned yet, so I thought it was worth throwing out there. But there are efforts, you can get involved, you can be part of building this curricular community and building these kinds of coursework opportunities for yourself. And there is also a Bass Connections that Mike Landry is here. I don't know, Mike, if you want to tell them about that.
Yeah, thanks. I was trying to figure out a way to get in there, and it's always hard to speak after Marion does, though, because then, you know, what everything I'm doing is kind of nothing compared to what she's doing. But hi, everybody. I'm not a very regular attendee here, but I'm a faculty at Duke. So maybe just to put a little plug that Marion and I and a few other folks recently were successful in getting one of the Bass Connection projects specific to COVID-19. So just hold on, Neela, you have to go back. Yeah. So this project, sorry about that. So this project is actually looking at the disproportional impact of COVID-19 on people with disabilities in North Carolina, more specifically in Orange, Wake, and Durham counties. And so the reason why I plug it is not that we got this small project, but that there's opportunity for graduate students and undergraduate students to spend a year with us, going through developing even a curriculum, a weekly curriculum, and ultimately getting credit for explorations in the space of disability. Very multi-intersectoral kinds of discussions. I personally, I'm a physical therapist. I come from the School of Medicine, but been learning a lot around, you know, the view of many in this particular area. So a little plug, early in the chat, I put the link that you can get to if you're interested in applying. Tragically, the deadline is like Friday. So, you know, kind of one of those things, you know, hurry up if you're interested, or if you know others who might be interested. So that's one thing. But and certainly, and I'll answer all the questions. But I also wanted to make a point about an earlier part of our discussion around accommodations. So I personally have found that, just to reflect, that a lot of the faculty are very open and sensitive to figuring out how to work with students and what needs to happen and how to create the level playing field. But quite honestly, and you know, those who are faculty here, let me know if you have a different experience, but there's very little resources. There's very little direction. There's very little next steps. Faculty are kind of making it up as they go along. So the outcome is not desirable because the structure is pretty weak. This COVID-19 has also had an impact in terms of allocation of resources to help. So it is time to make a point. And personally, I'm a little bit put back that Duke said nothing about the 30th anniversary. We make lots of points about other, you know, social issues that are critically important, but it would have been nice to see something come from the deans or even the chancellor. So I'll stop there, but thanks for giving me a few minutes, Marion.
Yeah, so is this going until 9 or a little bit after 9? How does it go? Just 1 hour?
We're hoping probably 90 minutes, yeah. And again, if you have questions, I think Maddie just said this in the chat, but please ask questions if you have them to any of our audience or professors, of course. And so, yeah. Maddie, do you wanna move on to the next topic just to cover some more ground?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So yeah, 90 minutes. So we can go up till 9:30, or if we are done early, we can definitely do that too. But our next question is, how does our university succeed or fail to be as inclusive as it could be? Some things you could think about in this would be things that could be immediately improved, or things that are right now really good in being inclusive, or also long-term improvements or long-term ways that Duke is inclusive. So whoever wants to respond to that, go ahead.
I can talk a little bit about deaf accessibility and hard of hearing. So I guess with something, so first of all, speaking with COVID and everything being online and on Zoom, it's definitely a mixed bag. And I think it just kind of depends on your situation. So for one thing, with most Zoom classes, you can see everyone at once, you can channel something directly to your hearing aid. But also I find it kind of funny that Duke has an $8 billion endowment and hasn't bought any sort of automatic captioning service for Zoom or most other things. I've taken several film classes and I have to explicitly ask for captions on everything that I actually want captions for, and so I've just kind of stopped doing it. And I only have minor hearing loss at this point. I would assume that SDAO would get you accommodations if you had a legal level of disability, but I think that it's just, why don't we just have it? So many people need it. And that also goes for people who have auditory processing problems. So with ADHD or some other mental illnesses, just depending on, you know, your specific circumstances, a lot of people benefit from captions and having the ability to turn it on and off. And then moving on beyond just Zoom captions, I think I mentioned earlier that things just aren't really set up for people with disabilities. I can't speak for people who have mobility issues, but we do have an ASL instructor who is in a wheelchair, or she uses a wheelchair. And just making sure that our lessons are accessible once a week is way harder than it should be. And it's unfair for her that she has to go around the long route and have a lot of difficulty parking and difficulty getting access to the building, and they still haven't gotten her a card to get in on her own. We have to go let her in every time because she has to use the entrance that requires a card instead of just getting in the front because she's a guest. And then she also got a parking ticket for parking in the handicap spot before 5 p.m. But where else could she park? Things like that. So yeah, there's just a lot of barriers, and I can't even speak to having to deal with that 24/7. But everywhere you look, there's something wrong. But then in terms of good things too, I know that my roommate has AED and she's had a lot of luck getting good accommodations and good professors. She's also in the pre-health track, so maybe they're more aware of it. I don't know how that would work out. My friend who has the room accommodations, now that she has them, she's very happy with that. Her quality of life has improved. So I think that there are good things out there, but it's a mixed bag right now. So yeah, I'll kind of stop talking about it now.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of new challenges with Zoom. For some, it also makes some in-person challenges, dissipate. So it's a very interesting time right now, I'd say. I think that, I think that there are some issues with with the whole virtual technology, and also with just registration. I noticed that a lot of classes they have this one format, and it seems like it's going to be better, but especially for our friends who are international and those sorts of things, if the classes you need are all synchronous, then what good are these asynchronous classes? So I feel like there should be more of a movement, and maybe there is, and I'm not aware of it, towards trying to get for always having an asynchronous option. And even with labs, it's kind of strange for some labs what they're doing. I was going to take Gen Chem 2 this semester, but they're only doing labs as an in-person credit. But what if this spring someone wants to also do virtual, because this might not all go away, and they're acting as though everyone should, in order to get the lab, be on campus at some point. And so there's just different things. I also think it's a challenge to expect people to have quiet spaces and solid Wi-Fi and all these other things. So that's an issue. Bailey mentioned the captioning problem. And I don't know, there's just, there's a lot of different issues. For me personally, having ADHD, I also process a lot of times better what I'm thinking, and those sorts of things, have my thoughts come together verbally, talking to other people, about being able to bounce ideas. And the virtual formatting doesn't allow for a lot of conversations that naturally happen normally in person before and after classes. And it also just serves as kind of a boundary, in a sense, to feeling like you can ask questions sometimes. Some people just feel very uncomfortable with the chat. You can't see people's full bodies and get an idea of people's full mannerisms, and in a sense that's debilitating for everyone. And so I think there are many issues, though it also is better for certain accessibility issues that you normally have in a class. One other thing that we haven't mentioned yet, but you might not be aware of, SDAO actually has a testing center now that you'll be able to use. And it's kind of strange how some classes, they either require or encourage you to use that, and other times they don't. One weird thing is, I guess, especially getting at the inclusivity question, is with accommodations, sometimes the professor will be in or like come regularly to the testing room, but obviously if you're in a testing facility, that doesn't happen. Sometimes they'll have a TA stay with you, but you won't have the actual professor there. Other times you might be in some other room and, you know, the professor doesn't really come. That's more in the rarity, but it does happen. And so, yeah, that's definitely an issue if you're someone that has questions that come up, especially if you're someone that, you know, feels like you need that question answered now. And so, or you might get to the end of the test and then, I don't know, then you lost a bunch of time because you didn't have that question answered, or I don't know. So there's a lot of different things along those lines. But I do think it's something that Duke's going to have to think about more, especially with this time. So, yeah.
Can I jump in real quick here? This is Jules. I just want to say that, I mean, I think that there's so much work that's already being done. Sorry, I'm going to put a better microphone on. So many things that have already been changed that I think has been a lot of the activism of DDA. I would just say that hopefully this feels like a time when I think faculty are coming to grips with how much of their own practices are not accommodatable. And how much they are missing in the real sort of teaching and learning process by sort of sticking with what's been a convention up to this time, right? Just because it's a convention. And so it seems, you know, sort of like while the iron is hot, there's an opportunity to really press this notion of accessibility and inclusion, because they're also having, you know, especially to those folks that are allies, because they're having to ask these questions of themselves, right? What really is rigor? What is testing? What is the purpose of grading in a particular kind of way? What are these mechanisms that we have sort of submitted ourselves to sort of say, well, this is what learning means, or this is what it's supposed to look like, when now that has to make some shifts, right? For everyone's good, and that should have been done a long time ago, right? For a lot of things. So I just would sort of encourage, there's going to be a lot of proactiveness that's going to have to be, that people have mentioned before, because there's lots of accommodating, and I'm not using that word to sort of diminish it, but just sort of like, oh, wait, I have to think about this. I have to think about this. But while you're thinking about this, here's a perfect opportunity to sort of build accessibility in from the start. Right? And having to do that when you have to work on a different platform or in different circumstances should be an aha moment for how we can possibly collaborate and with students, and also move forward more positively, more inclusively. So, you know, certainly I think that's a conversation that the faculty are trying to have. Each discipline is different, each faculty member is different, but it is, if you already recognize how you need to be accommodated, right, what works best for you, sort of helping them see that this could work for lots of people, for more than just one person, or, you know, again, trying to figure out ways not to have to put that burden on you, but how to make the system aware of it, or how make faculty sort of go, wait, I should know this in advance. How do I know this in advance? So that I'm ready to have a classroom that everybody can participate in, and feel is working for what they're wanting to get out of it. So just to throw that in there. Thank you all for continued advocacy work in this sort of vein, but also this year is going to be, I think, a really excellent opportunity, as much as it is a stress and a complicated space, to really help people have a aha moment about it.
Thanks for saying that, Jules. I agree. I agree that this is a time for faculty to be looking at their syllabus and to be looking at their teaching practice, and just really thinking about accessibility. And the way that I like to think about it is holistic access, which is across all different kind of identity categories, and thinking about students who might be from low-income backgrounds, which is kind of a minority at Duke, if we're being honest, but that's a really important culture shift. And I always like to sort of put myself out there to my students as a first-generation college student myself, and to sort of try and to make that distinction visible, because it often isn't. But to talk about like I was really grateful for Sydney mentioning and Jay mentioning before about the cost of getting your testing and the different health insurance things that you just need to sort of know in advance just to figure that out and make it work. But yeah, so I think when we're thinking about, going back to the original question was like, what is Duke doing or not doing to be inclusive? We can think about that along lines of race and class and gender and sexuality and sexual identity. So all of those things intersect, and we like to talk about that intersection in the disability space as well.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think just to echo a couple points that have already been made, I think Duke really fails to have this kind of perspective of universal design. Like, people have been alluding to this fact that really, like, whenever you design anything, whether it's a course, whether it's a building, or anything basically, that it should work for everybody regardless of what their abilities are. And so that's something that I think Duke really needs to work on, is to like have that sort of perspective in whatever their new endeavors may be. And like, I think in terms of like even like immediate improvements, like there are things they could do, like stop having classes. And well, actually for classes, SDA will move a class if it's in a place that's not accessible for you. But for extracurricular events, especially like not having those in the languages building, is one thing that Duke could do. And I think people have been more aware of that, but it's still happening. And like maybe like as a slightly longer term thing, maybe actually making the languages building accessible, not just adhering to the letter of the ADA, which is often the bare minimum, but actually looking from a holistic perspective, what can we do that actually works for everybody? In designing buildings, designing courses, designing a good college experience in general. Yeah, I think that's important.
Which is why what Bailey said about captions too is super important, because that is obviously an access point for students with hearing loss. And we have more students with hearing loss than we think we have. I think it's because it's an invisible disability. It just doesn't register for people, but there's a significant number of students that have that challenge. It makes it better for them, but it also is easier for students for whom English isn't a first language, or whose attention might wander in and out during class. I know that happens with me. And for myself, I'm a hearing person who always uses captions when I watch TV. And so it's just like, I would love to have that just be a little bit more of a given in sort of live Zoom discussions and things like recorded lectures. But it's at present hard to get. At present, the protocol is that you have to point to a documented disability in the class to get that accommodation. But we'll see how that plays out, because I'm going to ask for it anyway and just see what kind of response I get.
Yeah, and I mean, the captioning also helps just to sometimes understand what a word is if somebody is using some word that you're just unfamiliar with. It's like, what was that word? And so that notion of universal design is so important. And Marion, you can probably speak more to the new club that has just gotten started, the Duke Universal Design group.
Yes, I think so. Jolie Mason, who is a engineering student, she's a rising sophomore. She's a really wonderful student. She just decided to start a club that is a little bit more geared toward, I guess, the really more hands-on side of accessibility and design. So this could be appealing to students in Pratt, or students who are interested in fashion, or students who are interested in just computer science and web accessibility and things like that. And it's a kind of a space to bring those students together and to talk about universal design, and to also engage in activism for Duke to be more universally accessible. So it's a new exciting club, and it's kind of like a partner to DDA. We've seen a lot of new disability related clubs spring up in the last few years, and it's really exciting to me. And I think I see it as being just evidence of the fact that there's a lot of interest in various disability issues at Duke, and it's more than DDA alone can accommodate. So we've got a lot of sort of branch groups that are focusing on more specific goals. So yeah, if there's anyone on the call that wants to learn more about the many opportunities that exist for you to get involved in various aspects of disability advocacy, or just learning about disability, let us know. I think we have a fairly inclusive list of our partner organizations on our webpage, so you can start there as well.
Great. I also just wanted to bring a little bit of attention to some responses that people gave in the chat a little bit before about ways that Duke has been having a bit of success in inclusiveness. Simran mentioned that DDA, we have a task force of people that are creating accessible and tactile maps for our campus. I believe Jay is part of that group.
Yeah,
Jay, want to talk about that?
Yeah, just real quick, we also so a lot of the people that have been working on that graduated. Of course, I'm still here because I'm taking an extra semester. So I think that's definitely something that I want to look at in the last semester in terms of getting that continued after I leave. So I think we definitely want to work on getting more contacts in DSG. So hopefully, like, we'll have more going on there. But if you do want to help out with that, I suppose you can always email me. There's also a survey that I can put in the chat. I just have to find the link if you want to fill that out. Yeah, I'll do that.
Thanks, Jay. Awesome. And I just wanted to say one of our other past DDA members, Andrew Toig, just had said something in the chat that this may come as a surprise to those who know him, but he has some optimistic news about the law school. So Andrew, if you wanted to elaborate some more.
Yeah, so the law school historically has been not good at all from the perspective of disability accommodations. I've even heard their approach be described as, well, if anything's really bad, someone will sue us and we'll change it after the fact. Although I've heard that applied to Big Duke as well, but law school is kind of Duke on steroids. But after our kind of the previous semester ending of after they had transitioned to distance learning, I had the administration reach out to me and the current heads of the disability organization that I founded at the law school to proactively engage in a discussion about how they can better meet disability needs in planning for the curriculum for the upcoming semester. And I don't know what will come of that, but the fact that it was on the radar at all is huge. And then for everybody here, the pandemic is obviously creating a tremendous amount of suffering for a lot of people and is laying a lot of vulnerabilities bare, but it also does present a very unique opportunity for activism. So the law school is very ableist at its core. And for their first time, possibly in decades, possibly ever, all of these extremely high-performing lawyers, people who've been at the top of their everything their entire lives, are now, again, possibly for the first time, experiencing fear, experiencing a situation that they can't control, experiencing things that go poorly regardless of what they plan for, and really basically feeling to some extent or another what it feels like to be moving through the world and through Duke as a person with disabilities. And while that's obviously unfortunate that everyone's in that position, it creates what I'd like to call maybe some forced empathy, in that a lot of people who have just, maybe not through any sort of ill will, but just through their own life, never presenting them with an opportunity where they had to think about, you know, any form of accessibility. Now they do. You know, now you have anything from going to the store to, you know, getting daycare for their kids, whatever it is. pretty much everybody in any position of power, of authority right now is in a position where they're having to question the structures that they have never questioned before. And I think that some really positive changes can come out of it.
Thanks, Andrew. I like how your very optimistic news about the law school also involved a bit of people having forced empathy through a worldwide pandemic, but
Hey, well, it was the only way it was going to happen. We'll be honest, but
I appreciate your comments, and we all do. We have one final question for our panelists, if anybody would like to take it. And then after that, if anybody wants to put any questions in the chat, please feel free if there's time. So our last question is, what are some ways you have found support at Duke in academics, community, or mental and physical health, as well as anything you might want to speak about?
Yeah, I think personally for me, this club has been like a great support. Just like I said earlier, like being able to vent. That's some of the things that I'm going through. Like I think that's a need that people have. So I think that's definitely good, and this club is a resource for that, or anything else you want to do really related to disability, or even if you just want to come chat about like anything. I think we're pretty open to that as well. At least that's been my experience. So yeah, for me, DDA has been a big support. Moving some of the other stuff that we already covered, like the Academic Resource Center. And yeah, definitely DDA though. Big, I would say like definitely be involved if you need anything.
Sorry, you can go ahead.
Okay, yeah, just real quick, another couple that are good that I don't think we mentioned yet are like the Wellness Center. There's a lot of things offered there that are good for like mindfulness, all sorts of different things, like whether you're interested in like art or like yoga or tasting tea or like whatever. It's a good way to get your mind off things if you need to like debrief. And maybe for you, the best way to do that isn't necessarily venting with other people. Maybe you need something that's a little more like introspective or relaxing. So that's great. And then also I know like, I think it's called, there's an app that I heard of, I think it's called like, did I like write it down somewhere? Gosh, I'm trying to remember what it is, but there's definitely like resources that there's one particular app that Duke has paid to give us access to, even that's like a check-in with yourself. So to like help with, like mental health, or if you have some sort of more like mentally related disability. So that can be good. I think it's really important during your time at Duke to kind of like check in with yourself and like make sure that you don't feel like powerless in anything, that you don't feel like something's taking control of you're just falling in through something because you feel like you have to, because that's not good for you, that's not good for anybody, that's not what your Duke experience should be like. And so whether it's disability related or not, I think sometimes like the things that are being, I don't know, it's easy like when you're caught up in the chaos of things like on campus with classes and everything else that's going on to like not realize like the struggles, I guess, are as real as they are for you. And so I think whether it's like writing or whatever it might, like journaling, whatever it might be for you, finding a way to recollect, because you definitely don't want to go through, even a semester not addressing something that's going on with you that's important to you. So.
I think for me, I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier about just talking to people and being open with things. And that goes for, everything from mental health to being a low-income student to whatever you may be experiencing. I find that once you start talking about things, people will talk about them with you, and you'll find people who can relate, or maybe they can't relate, but they agree with you. And it's really nice. I don't know, like it's just really, I don't know, it kind of relieves something to be able to actually talk about that and be open and honest with each other, and find some support with that.
Yeah, especially since everything's going to be so different this semester with everything being so largely virtual and so many people in singles and all of that. Like, please, 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 like, try to find those communities and don't be afraid. Like, you're all in the same boat, all of you freshmen, like you're all experiencing the same thing. And it might be harder to like see that this semester with like all the distancing that's needed. But you do have community, you have people that are like, you know, like desiring so greatly to like journey with you, both upperclassmen and people who are in your own class. So definitely like be bold, don't be afraid to like reach out to people, to like take that first step and try to generate conversation, whatever it might be, because you are supported. I know it can be isolating just in general coming to college. So like, yeah, please reach out to people, reach out to us, reach out to anyone that you encounter, especially if you feel like you need it, because people are there for you and you're not alone.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that real quick. I feel like when you do share, and I'm not that, I don't want to say this to make you feel pressure that like you have to share whatever is going on with you, but I think if you do, it's not just helping yourself, it's helping other people who may be in a similar situation, because you're helping to change the culture when you do that. You're helping people be more open-minded, so I think that's also important to consider.
Thank you all. Those just all very valuable things to say. So, I mean, we've reached the end of our kind of panel discussion, and we're nearing the end of our time. So, I guess to wrap things up, again, if there's any questions from our new students, I know some of us, some of the new students have gone and come and gone. So, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to send them or speak up. Or if you just want to introduce yourselves, Dr. Q suggested that if you'd like a chance to introduce yourselves real fast, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jerome. I'm a new student, and I was just I have CP, so I was kind of just interested in coming today, but everything you guys said was super insightful, and I really want to thank all you guys for just your info and advice. That's really cool.
Thanks for coming, Jerome.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Great to meet you.
Great to meet you. Yeah, we're excited that you're coming to Duke.
Oh, and to plug this out loud, if you'd like to join any listserv that you heard or saw in the chat, maybe go by or something of the sort, feel free to email DDA and we'll direct you the right way. Or if you want to join DDA's listserv, of course, we can add you to our listserv as well. So yeah.
Yeah, if anybody else would like to introduce themselves, now's the chance.
And just because I forgot, the Duke Disability Alliance email to contact is Duke Disability Alliance, all one word, no caps, no spaces, at duke.edu. So. Well, we can go ahead and wrap up if everybody feels satisfied. I mean, I know I'm satisfied. I love every year. This is like one of the best things we do, just to get to check in with everybody and revisit some of the things that we have to say, and you know how we're all so supportive of each other. So.
It's occurred to me that one of the things that ASL could be really useful for is those quiet moments on Zoom where everyone's kind of awkward and nobody's talking, like going to each other and having sidebar conversations. But it's not mainstream enough, and most of us don't know ASL. So that's just another plug for Duke ASL.
Yes, it's fun. We'll all sign very badly, but it's fun to practice with each other. You have to practice.
Oh, and just to mention this, so you guys know, we're trying to with DDA start something more this year that's really supposed to act as a support and voice for people with who learn differently. That's what we're calling it, learning differently or something along those lines. Yeah, so if you want to be a part of that, or if we have enough interest, we'd like to make a space for people to just kind of come together and have a sense of community if you are someone who has some sort of learning disability. Please also contact DDA if you're interested in that, whether it be helping out or you'd be interested in a sort of community there. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Sydney. And just so everybody knows, this recording has gone well, so I'll get the link for that and try to put the video on our Facebook and on our YouTube channel so that other students can listen to this really great conversation we've had. I just want to thank everybody so much for this really awesome discussion. I think we all have so much great wisdom to share about the experience at Duke and advice, and it's really enlightening and uplifting to have these conversations every year. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, it's always an honor to be here, so thanks for having me. Hope everyone has a good evening.
Thanks,
All
Jay.
right. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Have a great night.